All right, welcome back to the third part of One Man's Faith. We're looking at the book of Esther and the celebration that is coming this week. That's called Purim. So Haman has a disdain for the Jews because he was an Amalekite. And because he's got this pride issue. And Mordecai, a Jew, won't bow down to him, an Amalekite. And so he stews now for 5 years trying to figure out what he's going to do. And somehow he came up with what's called casting lots. In other words, he was rolling the dice to see when this, he was plotting when to try and get rid of the Jews. And it fell to the month that's called, the 12th month, which is called Adar. And so Haman goes to the king and he says, there are certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of the other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out the king's business. And the king took a signet ring, handed it to him, and said, do what you want to do. So Haman put together this plan and said that on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, any man who wanted to could kill a Jew until they're all gone, and could have all of their possessions as plunder. And this decree went out to all 127 provinces. Well, when Mordecai heard this, it says he learned of it and he tore his clothes and he just started crying out. But everywhere that decree went, the Jews in that area started fasting, weeping, and mourning and crying out. Somehow Mordecai got word to Esther that, hey, this was going to happen, and it said Esther writhed in great anguish. I think because she thought that all of her nation was going to be wiped out, and she'd be the only one left. So Mordecai gives a copy of the edict to Esther and says to her to see what she could do in order to gain the king's favor. And she came back and said to Mordecai, listen, I can't even go into his presence unless he summons me. She said, I don't know if there's anything I can do. And Mordecai said to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than any of the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. And you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. He's saying, listen, how do you know that God didn't put you in this position of being the queen, knowing what Haman was going to try and do so that you could thwart it? Esther took that in, and she said, okay, I want you to assemble all the Jews. I want you to tell them, the ones that are here in the capital, not to eat or drink for 3 days. She says, I'm not going to eat or drink for 3 days. And then I'll go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. So she was going to do what she could. So they fast for those 3 days, and it says on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, went into the inner court, and somehow caught the eye of the king, and the king said, come here. And she came, and he says, what do you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And she said, well, if it pleases the king, I'd like for the king and Haman to come to the banquet at lunchtime today. And the king says, hey, how can we not? So he and Haman go to Esther's quarters for a banquet at lunchtime, and Haman was really pleased with this. And the king asked again, Esther, what do you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And she said, well, I want to have a very special banquet tomorrow for just you and Haman. Will you two come? And they both agreed to come. And it says that Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. And the only thing that that really messed him up was that he saw Mordecai. And Haman was filled with anger. And then he goes home and he tells his wife and his friends, hey, listen, man, he recounted to them all the riches, all the glory of his riches, the number of his sons and all this stuff. And Haman said, even Esther, the queen, let not one but me, let no one come but me with the king to the banquet. And tomorrow I'm invited to go with her and with the king. He says, and all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting in the king's gate. And his wife and his friends said, hey, build a gallows and hang him tomorrow. Oh. And so he builds a gallows 50 cubits. Now 50 cubit is a foot and a half. So a 75-foot tall gallows is built at Haman's house. And Haman was going to go in the next morning and say, King, this guy is against you. I'm going to hang him. And expecting the king to say, okay, do what you want to, just like he did before about the decree that was sent out in the king's name. Well, during the night, the king can't sleep. So, I guess calling for the phone book or for an encyclopedia because he can't sleep. He wanted to read something so he could fall asleep. He calls for the chronicles of the events that have been happening, and he just happens to come across the part about Mordecai saving the king. And the king in the morning says, has anything been done to honor this man who saved my life? And it was said, no, nothing's been done. Well, Haman was just coming in to get with the king. And the king said, well, is anybody in court? And it just so happened, Haman was coming in. And so the king said, call him here. And so he said, oh boy, here's my chance. And before he could say a word, the king says, hey, what would you do for somebody who has saved your life and you want to honor them? Well, Haman thought he was talking about him. And so Haman said, well, here's what I would do if it was me. I would call for the king's best horse. I would put the person on the horse with a robe and a crown, and I would have somebody lead him around the city crying out about his good deeds, because he was expecting himself to be the one to put on there. And so the king says, that's great, Haman. You go out, find Mordecai, and do exactly what you said. Oh, that's so neat. You said, I'm sorry. But Haman's caught. The king said, do it. He cannot not do it. And so, totally against his own wishes. And do you see the mud being smeared into Haman's face for this thing? His pride, everything got to him. And so, Haman goes home. Oh, and he's mortified. He tells his wife and he tells his friends what's happened to him. And they say this to him. They say this to Haman. If Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him. But will surely fall before him. Let me read that again. This is what his wife and friends said to him. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Whoa. You see, even the people there understood the awe of God that was on the Jewish people. You see, even going back to Nebuchadnezzar brought them out. Nebuchadnezzar, if you remember, kind of accepted God and would not harm the Jews. And then Cyrus, just before Ahasuerus, had sent the Jews back. The favor that they had with the kings in Babylon and Persia and Media was just so awesome that these people say, you can't touch him. If he's a Jew, you can't touch him. As a matter of fact, he will fall upon you. And Haman didn't have time to do anything because the king's guards came for Haman to take him to this special banquet that Esther has set up. And so it says in chapter 7 that the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day as they were drinking wine, "What's your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom will be yours." So they were merry. They were probably had too much wine, okay? They probably had too much wine. And the queen says, the queen says something which we'll have to look at here in just a minute after we take this break. So, sit in suspense as you wait to hear what Queen Esther says, and I'll be right back.